All right. Hey, thanks for making it out. I know this is late Friday, and you know there's the temptation to go get on standby for an earlier flight, or I saw a lot of people at W having drinks, and they've done the learning. Now they're going to do the networking. That's cool too. Maybe I'll do that afterwards. But seriously, thanks for coming out and choosing to attend my talk. And before I go into talking about roguelikes, which is what you guys are here to hear about, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Tom Cadwell, Vice President of Game Design at Riot Games, and in terms of games I worked on, most recently, of course, was League of Legends, where I was the design director, and prior to that, I was the play balance guy on Warcraft 3 expansion, and did a bunch of different design stuff on World of Warcraft, leading up to launch. Sorry. And these days, most of my time is spent helping Riot, especially game designers, be innovative in game development and game design in particular. And to do this best, I think it's really important to draw upon the broadest inspiration and sources you can. And I think that's especially important to do that outside your genre. I think in the past, I certainly see these job ads like, oh, looking for 15 years of RTS experience or whatever. And I think it's really critical to be broadly played. And at Riot, we all spend a lot of, we're passionate about playing broad games. We also spend a lot of effort trying to sample broadly and consistently. And I think that, as developers, it's just really key not to constrain yourself by a genre, because a lot of the best innovations that have emerged from games have come from other places. Like, for example, I remember the mailbox system in WoW. I remember these conversations, 14 years ago, 13 years ago, where the source of the idea was Animal Crossing, of all things, right? There's just a lot of random sources. I also think, though, that the craft of game design and game development are really about games, not about genre. So I think as developers, it's critical to continue to broadly play games. And that pursuit and that passion led me to conclude that roguelikes, tapering back into my topic here, have a bunch of underappreciated design lessons that can be applied elsewhere, and I'd like to share those with you guys today. So in terms of how this talk is structured, first I'm going to give my definition of a roguelike. I've read there's a bunch of different definitions, and I just want to present my perspective so that there's general alignment in the talk. From there, I'm going to talk about how roguelikes are engaging because of mastery, and how a lot of other games are as well. And by mastery, I mean the experience of learning and getting better at a game. And I'm going to briefly define what I see as that sort of process of learning. From there, I'm going to go into how roguelikes specifically have design patterns that amp up their mastery potential and drive that really long-term engagement. And I'm going to cover a couple different concepts there. And from there, I'll do an analysis of some non-roguelike games and talk about how I think they've either co-evolved or leveraged some roguey elements, and then speculate on how additional roguelikiness could potentially be applied to those games to enhance their gameplay. And then we should have 5 to 10 minutes afterwards for Q&A, which my understanding is that will be done across the hall at the end. So the original roguelike is, of course, Rogue, which I guess implicitly is a roguelike. And that was from about 1980. And in it, by the way, who has played one of these games really early? Okay. So it's about 35%-ish. Okay, so these are pretty hardcore games, and the basic structure of them, including Rogue, of the original kind of games of this type, were that it's like a character RPG, turn-based, where you descend through a bunch of levels to eventually recover, in this case, the Amulet of Yender, and then ascend to the surface and win. And these games are sort of notorious for their really high difficulty, for permadeath, and limited or no saving ability. Certainly no ability to replay a death, for sure. These games are super, super popular at colleges. They still are today, but they're exceptionally popular in the 80s, where you go to a computer lab at a university at 2 a.m. and you'd see half the workstations occupied by people playing one of these games. And it's been a really influential game that spawned a lot of mods and inspired buys and so forth. For example, one that I really like is, I really wish I'd put more hours in this game than I have, but I put a decent number, is NetHack. And NetHack is kind of an offshoot of Hack, which was offshot from Rogue. And it's sort of I think it's maybe the most fully featured game ever. It's, for example, you can train your pet with pet treats to rob stores reliably, right? It's pretty interesting stuff. And they just did a lot of world simulation, really interesting mechanics. And then the modern ones, there's been a modern resurgence, I think, driven by the availability of good game engine technology and a really thriving indie scene. And these are the modern hybrid roguelikes, which are, I think, predominantly roguelike and usually have replaced the core combat engine with something. And who's played like at least one of these games a little bit? All right, so yeah, so you guys all have played roguelikes. Now, leave your hands up. Who has played these? So everybody who played a roguelike listed here, hands up. Okay, so who of you played at least one of these games at least 100 hours? Yeah, so, right, like that's pretty high engagement. I know a lot of you still said no, but that's still like about half of you who did have done that. And, I think that's pretty interesting. And, leading into this slide, you're probably asking, okay, well, that's interesting insight, Tom, but why are we switching over to StarCraft and Angband slide? And the reason is, when I was in college, which was, I'm just going to date myself here as I'm slowly aging, 1997 to 2001, okay? My fraternity brothers and my relatively game-loving fraternity were really into a bunch of games. And, I was playing StarCraft a lot, about 70 hours a week at one point. A lot of my fraternity brothers were playing EverQuest extensively. Of course, there was Final Fantasy VII and, Mario Kart and so forth. But then also, like, a couple dudes were playing Angband, like, pretty much as I was playing StarCraft over summer break. And that's a lot. I mean, if you just compare these two games together, like, it's like you got, next-gen graphics on the left from, 1995 and next-gen graphics from 1973, what is it about roguelikes that, despite all the clues, the hardcoreness, the arbitrariness, the antiquated graphics, that makes them so engaging? Where the modern versions, which I think graphically do have some of the same disadvantages compared to broad games, are still engaging people so much. And I think the answer is mastery. And by that I mean like I said earlier, the feeling of getting better over time. And I think roguelikes provide a means for ongoing long-term mastery that holds players' interest for hundreds or maybe even thousands of hours. And when I think about the most engaging games, the games that consistently, across some quorum of players, can engage that long, I mean, generally you're talking about games like StarCraft, Street Fighter II, Dark Souls, MOBAs such as League of Legends, and even like if you think about World of Warcraft, which I think has a lot of other things going on that drive its immense engagement. Mastery is a big part there too. You talk about like getting past a boss with your guild or getting really good at PvP. And certainly, I mean, not all games require deep mastery to be long-term engaging. I mean, I think Minecraft would be a good example, and there's others as well. But I would maintain that the majority of games that engage players' interest for hundreds or thousands of hours are built on this feeling of mastery and getting better. And the way this sort of works for players is pretty simple. Basically, you counter challenge, your best just isn't good enough, and that's failure. And from that failure, you start to learn, and eventually you encounter you encounter that challenge again, and you're successful. And it feels much better than ordinary success because it's a success that you earned that's built on self-improvement. And that's something really special and just feels really good. And I would maintain as long as players are feeling that they're getting better and learning, it's pretty difficult to actually get bored of a game. You might find something else capture your interest, but it's pretty hard to get straight up bored of the game. And I'm going to walk through Mario really quick just to talk about some examples of what I mean by mastery, of like specific things to master. And this is important because, and I'm going to allude to this later, but to the extent that we can make our games have multiple vectors of mastery, we're setting ourselves up for success. So in Mario, the most prevalent form of mastery is just mechanical skill and dexterity. And this is common in any real-time game in general. And this would just be things like, hey, dodging attacks, jumping between platforms with correct timing, even jumping at all correctly, killing monsters, in the detailed moment-to-moment way correctly. And certainly when you think about like, fighting game, and that's a key piece for sure. Mario also, although less so than maybe certain other modern games or certainly strategy games, has a significant amount of strategy and judgment. This is just around like, hey, should I wait it out and be patient here? Should I even go for those bonus coins? Should I go for that bonus life? Should I go for any number of risky plays? And just understanding like, hey, like I really need to play safe here because Fire Flower is generally pretty important against the monster classes here, and if I lose it, it's gonna be a lot harder. And of course, knowledge and understanding. This is sort of the easiest type of mastery to foster, which is just the mechanics of what do monsters do, and understanding that allows you to start to participate in other forms of mastery, or where's the hidden stuff, or what do the power-ups do, things like that. Conspicuously absent from Mario is teamwork, which is a really deep well of mastery that any multiplayer game will draw from at least a little bit if it's a team multiplayer game. And I think when you see like part of Counter-Strike would be an example of a game that significantly leverages this for its replayability. And if you're successful as a game designer, setting up your game with a lot of different forms of mastery, where there's a lot of different skills players can improve on, you start to make possible random parallel learning. And this is basically the idea that players are sort of at different times, perhaps subconsciously chosen, or whenever they feel like it, I guess, to some extent, are choosing to or unconsciously learning some skill. And the idea is that the more you have things to master, and the less you're constraining players on a very specific thing to master, such as pass this specific boss, for example, the higher the chance that in a particular play session, they're going to have a critical aha moment, right? And feel really good about that aha moment, and know that they learned something, and thus feel fulfilled in the game. I also think that the other big advantage of stimulating through random parallel learning, other than sort of increase in engagement coming from the aha moment, is has to do with sort of the natural nature of it. So here we have a kid studying for a test, I guess, and most people don't love studying for tests unless it's a subject they're super interested in. And honestly, like, I've learned a lot more about some topics just sort of being inspired to go on a Wikipedia bender. And not too long ago, I did this giant Wikipedia bender about soil bacteria, biochemistry, and its interaction with different plants. Which, by the way, that's gonna be my talk next year at GDC. You just tell Colleen if you're interested, and they'll give me a little pull there. But basically, this random parallel learning is much more like how people prefer to learn, which is when they feel motivated to do so. So if you remove those blockages, you get there. I'm going to talk in a moment about how League of Legends has pretty strong random parallel learning, but the audio and the video is all jacked. So you're just going to see an animated video, and if you really care, I guess I can try to get you the other one later. But anyway, so in League of Legends, so there's a bunch of different skills you can master. I mean, the obvious ones would be like, for example, if you're a jungler, you might have jungle timing, or you might have like basic teamwork and ganking skills, or judgment around if that was even a good decision to be pushing that tower, or decisions around timing, taking objective versus pushing a tower, or here we have Baron, and then the decision to counter gank. You have the execution within the team fight of, how do I dodge the skill shots? That's like, dexterity-based mastery. You might have, skill shot avoidance, same thing. Judgment around which characters should be focus fired first, sort of presence of mind and not get stressed. There's just like a lot of different things. Like one game maybe get better at last hitting, another game you just get better at not overextending. And I think that, as players master, of course, they're achieving victory more. But, I think fundamentally that, MOBAs have been so sticky with so many players because they offer so much random parallel learning to players that you just always feel like you're learning something, getting better. So we still haven't talked about roguelikes very much, so I'm going to switch to that now and sort of articulate how roguelikes implement their design in a way that stimulates random parallel learning and mastery in general. And I'm going to do that by just providing a few design patterns that I think are relevant. So the first I want to talk about is this idea of hero or zero. And this is sort of the name I came up with to sort of describe this confluence of hardcore consequences, permadeath, you made a bad move, you're dead, combined with sharp in-session progression where your starting character might grow in power 100 or 1,000x by the time you're at the end of the game in terms of actual game effectiveness. And if you do this hero zero pattern in a game, you get Boromir's giving me advice here, but you get a couple benefits. The first is that because players are expecting failure, they start to get in this mindset of looking for the positive. And the positive in a roguelike and games like it is that you learn something, or that you made progress that you haven't made before, which is related to you learning something. Additionally, because failure is the default, players start to remember the high moments where they did something cool, or got farther than they did, or really or beat the game for that matter. And that contrast is really important. And players really fixate on the positive and the negative, and I'll go into that a bit more in a second here. And lastly, I think for game designers, we can be lazier game designers. And no, actually, not lazier, but you can focus your energy away from play balance. So, if you have sharp progression, that implicitly means that as players are progressing, level to level, whatever happened play balance-wise level before is kind of just erased, right? Because the progression is so sharp and exponential. Challenges are stronger, your abilities are stronger, et cetera. So if you as a designer make a play balance error, one level, it can kind of get erased. The other side is that if players are expecting the game to be kind of harsh and kind of hardcore and setting them up for failure a lot of the time, they're more likely to just sort of forgive you and just say, that's just kind of the way the game is, rather than say like, you designers suck, this is a bad game, I hate this game. So I think it's really helpful, for design, and it helps us do crazier, more creative stuff as designers when we can embrace this. And a game that I think does this extremely well is Binding of Isaac, which I saw a number of you have played. But for those of you who haven't, and I would recommend this game, I think it's a really, really terrific indie game. It's basically a dungeon crawling RPG using kind of the original Legend of Zelda combat model with a bunch of modifications, of course, where you descend through a bunch of levels, steadily growing in power to defeat first your mother and then eventually Satan. And it's based on a true story. Lifetime will be airing the first part of the miniseries in April. So I've had playthroughs of this game where at the end of the game I had just nuts DPS, and I got burned down. The hardest boss is in literally seconds, when usually they're a minutes-long fight towards the end. And I've also had sessions where I'm limping along and things are going really bad, and I either just made a stupid mistake and died, or I got a really lucky break and got back on track and went on to have a great playthrough. But as a player, I only remember the runs where I made an awesome recovery, or had a super, super epic victory where my character power is just off the charts at the end. I don't really remember the gazillion other times where I died. And there's an achievement, I think, for a number of kills or number of deaths, and I'm pretty sure I have the 100 deaths at this point. That's good as a player. But as the designer, I know those negatives exist. And it's fascinating that players really fixate on those positives and don't fixate and generally get frustrated in the negatives once they get into the mode of these games. And that's really interesting, and I think it's something that we really should understand and leverage, because it's really interesting, because the high moments are what seem to work here. And to the extent that you're interested in implementing this in your own game or roguelike for that matter, I think there's a couple things to bear in mind. First is you have to provide players a real ultimate power fantasy. And by that I mean, you need to be able to get super powered in the game and then enjoy that moment. If it's kind of soft, it just isn't there. Secondly, you should ceremonialize things. And what I mean by that is ceremony is to call attention to the same point. You have a marriage ceremony to call attention to the fact, hey, this is important, right? So you add ceremony to games, tell players, hey, you killed this boss for the first time. That's important. Congratulations. Or you beat the game for the first time. Or you've never done this much damage in the game. If you can add ceremony, you can call it to players when they learned something or did something cool, and that helps them feel those high moments and savor them. And lastly, I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but I think it's very tempting to mix strong out-of-session progression with strong in-session progression. So you might have a meta character that's leveling up, and then you have the in-session where you're also leveling up. That's typically pretty hard to pull off. I'm not saying it can't be done, because most things can be done, but I think it's pretty tough. And generally, the attempts I've seen to do this well, like in FTL, which I'll introduce later, generally leverage a lateral progression approach where out of session is one type of progression that's not power, and in session is power, or vice versa. The next design pattern I want to talk about is this idea of diverse tools and causing players to have to make do. Generally in roguelikes, players have diverse challenges, and they have diverse tools. And those diverse tools are often the imperfect tools. So there might be an ideal tool, but a lot of time a roguelike will force a player to deal with a B level or C level or no tool at all to deal with the situation. And there's a couple benefits to this. The first is that by designing for this, you really encourage player activity and reward it. You basically get this designer-player contract going where you basically tell players, look, if you were a little more creative and thought a little bit more about what was available, you might have been able to make it through that. And additionally, by sort of incenting players to learn these tools, by putting them in situations where they have to use these tools, you actually get players to sample in a way they feel excited about a larger percent of your content. I know we've all made games where it's like, you put all this TLC in and made, not DLC, TLC, right? That's before release, non-monetized as opposed to after. But you put all this TLC in, you had all this, awesome content, and it's great, and then players are like, I'll just use this axe because it's really overpowered, and I don't really care about that other stuff. And all that effort goes to waste, and players don't enjoy it, and they probably would have enjoyed it if they tried it. Well, if you embrace this virtue of not letting players have too much consistent availability of tools, or having to make do or make hard choices about the tools they do have, they're going to enjoy a lot more of the content and ultimately master more things and have more fun. So I didn't have a screen cap for what I'm going to talk about here because the game is text-based. Does anyone know what this creature is? Close. Cockatrice, yes. Very good. OK, thank you. So yes, this is a cockatrice, which, because it's cockatrice, you know what game this is from? Yes, from NetHack. Yes, and NetHack, yes, and cockatrices turn you to stone, which is bad, because generally lethal. It's always lethal unless, for example, you're a stone giant, which I'll get to in a minute. So, cockatrices are really deadly and really angry, and you have to deal with them. And NetHack provides players a variety of ways to deal with this. Go Google it after this talk if you're curious. But the best tool, honestly, is to just polymorph yourself into something that is both stoning immune, or stoning resistant technically, stoning immune, and extremely dangerous. So, like a stone golem would be a reasonable choice. Of course, that's a pretty powerful tool, and the first time you encounter these, it's not that likely you're going to have really high-quality access to polymorphing. So you often have to make do, and making do could be things like, I don't know, use your consumable wands, which are really powerful but limited, or use some ranged weapons, some soaring weapons or whatever, or you could lure the cockatrice into a pit trap and then just wail on it, or you could take your chance and go hand to hand and just make sure you have an antidote. So you could carry around a stone to flesh scroll, or I guess if you eat a lizard corpse, that countermeasures stoning as well. It's very strange. But the point is, there's a bunch of different tools you could use to handle a cockatrice, and you probably won't have the ideal tool. But expert NetHack players know all the tools, know exactly how to use them, and feel really good about the fact that they've learned to do that. And in terms of applying this design pattern to games, I think the most important thing, I'll actually do these out of order, I wrote them. I think the first is that tools need to be limited in some way. And by that, it could be that they're inconsistently available. It could be that you can only pick A, B, or C, and all of them have different uses that are important. It could be that there's a lot of cooldowns. It could be that they're just not provided to you when you need them by some mechanics. So I think that's really, really important and can force players. If it's done in a way that doesn't feel arbitrary and lame, that feels just natural to the game, players naturally get into this sort of making do and creativity mode. I also think it's important that challenges inherently do respond well to multiple tools. And as you go through design, you can think about if the tool is just too powerful broadly, you really should think about is this actually decreasing gameplay potentially? But that being said, I don't want to encourage you guys to go into your game and over-nerf a bunch of tools, because if you don't have super powerful tools, you're going to undermine a lot of other aspirational elements of your game. Like if you want to have a hero zero pattern, you certainly can't do that with weak tools. So I think there just has to be a balance of availability that organically causes players to have to make do. The next design pattern I'd like to talk about is an idea called competing objectives and strategic commitment. And I had a tough time finding a name for this, and this maybe it doesn't seem logical to group these together, so I want to give some background on this. When I was building this talk, I was trying to isolate what causes roguelikes to have such really rewarding, sharp, rich, interesting decisions. So roguelikes are able to offer players stuff like, I don't know, lose all ability to heal in exchange for really strong vampiric effects, where you do damage to heal, or lose half your maximum health permanently and get double damage permanently. And in a lot of games, people are like, that's interesting. I don't really know if I want to take that in this playthrough. But in roguelikes, people jump on that and are super enthusiastic about it. It's kind of interesting. And I think Roguelike set this up with two pieces. The first is they offer really sharp competing objectives where the way to pursue the objectives is different. So for example, that might be short-term survival, which is generally health, food, things like that, versus your long-term power objectives, which are inherently somewhat deferred, right? Or you might have like two alternating character builds. Like you might have two mage builds, let's say fire and ice, and in between is just kind of not very effective. You're just not optimizing. So what roguelikes do, they have these competing objectives, and then they dangle in front of you really, really, really powerful stuff that often will really make progress on one objective, but actively undermine or come at the expense of or just not help the other objective. And as a player, you go, before you get this tantalizing upgrade, you might have like a strategy you're going to do or a preference you want to do. And you get this in, am I still strategically committed to my old strategy? Or does this warrant a change? And also, which objective is actually more important to me? And when players get into this mode of sort of assessing like in detail which objective really is more important, which strategy they really want to commit to. That's a really like rewarding kind of thought exercise to go through, and players feel really good when they finally make the decision. And they feel like doubly good, because that's strategic judgment as opposed to choice comparison. So just to back up for a sec, I think in a lot of RPGs, you'll be going through the dungeon, and you have your sword that does like 10 DPS, and a new sword drops, and it's like, well, it's slightly slower cooldown, but it's 50%, or it's slightly longer swing cooldown, but it's like 50% more DPS. So, yoink, I'll equip that, duh, right? That's not terribly interesting. Like, that feels good, but that's not really interesting. These kind of like nuanced trade-offs and forcing yourself to understand what you value and then make a bet potentially on that choice, I think just is more interesting. And when it does work off, it feels really, really good because you feel that you were like a smart, masterful player who understands the game and, had a good measure of your own abilities and the risks of the game. And I think FTL has a really good implementation of this, and I just want to introduce it really quick for those of you who haven't played it. Also a game I highly recommend playing. Both I would play it first without the expansion, then try to get the expansion pack after you've digested some, because those are kind of, well, I guess you can disable it, but they're different experiences. But in FTL, you play a ship fleeing the rebels. You're the Empire. It's kind of a little bit of a role reversal. To deliver critical knowledge to your fleet and win the war. But honestly, you're just trying to flee the rebels and then blow up their mothership. That's really what the game's about. And as you hop system to system, you encounter varied challenges, kind of in a roguey fashion, and you sharply progress your ship from kind of a garbage truck into a really powerful battleship. So it's very roguelike kind of progression. And I think FTL does a great job of forcing players to weigh various goals and determine which one is more valuable at any time. So for example, at any time you have to worry about fuel and damage. If you take too much damage, you die and you lose, right? And if you run out of fuel, you incur a lot of short-term costs that end up being kind of mid-term costs in some ways to deal with that. And you also have opportunity costs of exploring less. At the same time, though, you need to be building up for killing the enemy mothership at the end. And you also are trying to have a good, smooth progression in the midterm because different ship builds have synergies. So you kind of commit to a direction. If you deviate too much, you lose a lot of effectiveness, and that's bad too. So a situation where FTL leverages these competing objectives into a really interesting decision, right, where you have to strategically commit, would be if you're, say, you've been farming a lot and you've accumulated a lot of scrap, which is the game currency, and you pull into a shop, and at the shop you see, and by the way, let's say you have like 5 hit points. You're pretty close to done, and you're pretty low in fuel. And you see like an awesome item for sale, like weapon pre-igniter, which is like a really great thing to turbocharge a beam, like a laser build. Or maybe you see the cloaking device, which is really critical for beating the mothership. Not critical, but as close to it as you can get. And when you see something like that, you really have to go through that thought process of like if I pick this thing, can I make it through the next repair opportunity, or should I play it safe, knowing that I might might not see this item again for the rest of the game. And that's really interesting. Just as a side note, one critique I do have of FTL is I think that their scrap system, in which you kill ships and get scrap, which they can upgrade your systems, actually provides too much consistency of tool availability to the player, and in some cases can really mute the variety of experiences in FTL. I think the expansion adds a lot of other variety to the game to offset this, but that would be my main critique, even though this was probably my favorite game of that year. Binding of Isaac also does a great job of this. What you're looking at here is the Devil Room, which is a shop where you can exchange permanent health in exchange for upgrades. And so what the game is essentially doing here is it's saying, hey, do you want to take a short-term risk to your survival on an otherwise somewhat successful run in exchange for, if you pick this red thing on the right here, the little squigglies, a large increase in DPS and mobility. If players choose to do that, and by the way, for context, to get to Devil Room, it's sometimes random chance, but usually it's you executed perfectly on the level and took no damage. So you're usually feeling pretty confident at this point. But maybe you wouldn't feel as confident if you had a lot less health. But players are basically given this challenge here, and you have to make a hard decision. So that when you do, if you nerf your health and you take this damage upgrade and then you succeed, you feel really good about it. But like I said before, if it fails, you just kind of forget about it and you move on, which just this whole pattern is very synergistic with the Hero Zero. So in terms of instilling this decision quality in games, I think there's a couple important things. One is it's important to clarify trade-offs so players mechanically know what they're getting into. So a simple example of this is Binding of Isaac. I don't understand why they don't tooltip the items in game in some way, because everybody just plays with Wikipedia open until they have a really high skill level in the game and just recognize things. I think that that kind of information helps players get in the strategic space and out of the sort of I don't know. I mean, I guess there's some merit to the exploration thing. I just don't really agree with that design decision. I also think that it's important that your goals are balanced. And I'll talk to this later when I talk a little bit about civilization. But if you have different objectives that really do compete and where decisions tend to favor one over the other, that's going to tend to set you up for interesting decisions. And coupled with that, you do have to offer sharp decisions. Otherwise, if it's too gradual, players just can't really make a strategy switch. And lastly, I do think there's some benefit if the future's a little bit ambiguous around hey, well, I see this upgrade again. Hey, what are exactly the enemies I'm going to face? I'm not saying it should be random, but a little bit of variety there can enrich the decision space. And the last pattern I want to talk about is this idea of that variety is superior to randomness. And I put this in here because I seem like, okay, I'm doing a talk about roguelikes. People are going to assume I'm going to talk about random procedural content because all roguelikes have, or most roguelikes have random procedural content. Key word there being procedural, which effectively makes it less random. But anyway, my position on this is that Players love variety. They love having varied experiences, and varied experiences really set up, random parallel learning and mastery of a bunch of different things, and keep it interesting in other ways as well. But not all variety is created equal. I mean, some variety is just lame or boring or hard in a way, or impossibly hard as opposed to challenging. And I think that when we go full random as designers, we're missing out on an opportunity to basically make the game better. And I'm just going to be a really simple case in point here, which is traditional D&D. So if you're a DM in D&D, the party kills some big beastie, and you're like, well, what loot shall I give? And the Dungeon Master's Guide conveniently gives you a random loot table that you could use. And so you roll the random loot table, and your first roll you get, okay, military pick +2. Who uses a military pick +2? Very few characters. So if you gave the party that, they'd be kind of like, oh, cool, loot we can't use. I guess we'll be selling that. It's not super exciting. Or if you roll it, you might roll something they weren't really expecting or asking for, but it's interesting. You might roll a rope of climbing, right? And there's things people could do with a rope of climbing that'd be interesting. And I know in some versions of D&D, those are very different power level items, so forgive me for that. But the point is that's an example of using the random table and then curating as a designer to produce a result that's actually interesting to players. So now that I've gone over what I think are some of the more interesting, and obviously I didn't cover all the roguelike patterns, but I covered the ones I find pretty interesting. I'm going to talk about some non-roguelike games and how I think there's some similarities, how they perhaps leverage some of these patterns effectively, and also just go through how one might apply roguelike patterns to them to enhance them somewhat. And again, I just want to reinforce, like, one message I want to have in this talk is just that being genre agnostic as a designer to a degree and really sampling widely will make you a better designer. And just to refresh, because that was a lot of material pretty quickly, the patterns I did go through were random parallel learning, which is the idea that learning a bunch of things all the time in the order the player desires is more engaging. I talked about Hero Zero, which was just this idea that having really memorable, intense high points with an expectation of failure most of the time where you have a lot of low points is generally a pretty favorable pattern. Next, I talked about diverse tools making do, which is just this idea that by limiting tool availability to players, they learn to make do and be more creative and ultimately master more things and engage with more content. I talked about competing objectives and strategic commitment, which is this idea of if you have competing objectives, you set up really interesting strategic choices that are motivating to players. And lastly, I just talked about the idea that variety is superior to randomness. Randomness is just potentially a delivery vehicle. So wouldn't be a GDC game talk without Dark Souls. Dark Souls players here? Yes. That's it? Oh my God, okay. All right. Oh, okay. Well, seriously, it has this reputation, but it's actually a really rewarding game to play, even if you only play it for 10 or 15 hours. But Dark Souls does a great job of showing players they've mastered things. I remember I was playing Dark Souls, and I had the hardest time with Silver Knights. I don't remember the level they're on, but they're pretty hefty, and they're like 2,000 soldiers, and they want to kill them. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't played Dark Souls, it's like an action-adventure game. It's sort of like like an ultra-hardcore version of God of War with significantly more character customization. Maybe that's how I would describe it. So I had to learn to beat these guys, and I'd fight them, I'd lose a lot of health, and I'd lose more health, and I was having to use my healing potions, and slowly getting through it. Eventually, barely got through the section of the game with these guys. And some hours later, of gameplay later, I think I slept in between. I encountered them again because I had to go back to that area for something I missed or whatever. And I was just like punking them down, like there's bam, dead, like no problem. And I felt really good. I was like, wow, like I perfectly mastered this. And I felt super sweet. And I think because Dark Souls has this reliable single player content thing going where you can backtrack, it really reinforces mastery super well. So one of the features I like about Dark Souls, you have character classes kind of. I mean, it's more anybody can do anything really, but I mean you have a starting class. And one archetype you could go with is the Pyromancer, where you get all sorts of super powerful fire attacks, which are generally pretty powerful, especially I mean they're powerful in general, but they're pretty good early. And they really can trivialize some content on a relative basis as Dark Souls goes. I mean, obviously if you don't know what you're doing, you're still going to die, but it's, notches down the difficulty from like a 9 to like a 6 in a lot of cases. Until you encounter Kiss, which Quelaag, I guess is how it's pronounced, who is a giant fire spider who happens to be fire immune, which is a problem. So as a Pyromancer, hopefully at this point you've been making a little effort to learn to use your weapon. You probably have, but you're probably not great at it. And you're now in the situation where you have to make do with not your choice tool. Well, I'd rather burn her down trivially with my Pyromancer spells, but I guess I'm going to have to learn to use my weapons better. So maybe you go buy a bunch of consumable arrows or crossbow bolts and try to fight her that way. Or maybe you just try to man mode and get really good at your melee weapon and just learn to take her down like a normal sword and board character would. Or maybe you want to invest some souls and just buy a bunch of consumables to give your the pine sap or whatever to give your weapon lightning damage to kind of burn her down quickly. But the point is the Pyromancer will expose you to situations where you really do need to make do. And also part of the replayability of this game is as you play additional playthroughs, most players will play other archetype builds. And in doing that, they're going to expose themselves to a totally different set of challenges because the game just has so much nuance and depth to the basic combat model that really enable that. I I'm gonna be really cautious in how I position my criticism here. So Dark Souls is anything but random parallel learning. I mean, that's not quite true, but it's really not into random parallel learning, right? Like, you can do bosses out of order, but there's kind of a better order to do them. And you can definitely get in a situation where the boss you pretty much need to clear, you're just not getting it, and you're not strong enough, or you're just not able to get your player skill level in the place it needs to be, and you just go and farm basically until you're powerful enough to pass it, and that works okay for Dark Souls because of its shtick of being like so hardcore, and you're going to die a lot and all this other kind of stuff. I think it only works for Dark Souls because of this expectation, along with the fact that single player games put way less frustration pressure on you than multiplayer games. So, I don't think it's best practice if you're not making Dark Souls, and there's a lot of ways I think you can make a just as fiendishly difficult, probably more fiendishly difficult game, but still just as rewarding in the absence of some of the bottlenecking that Dark Souls does present. And again, I love this game. I'm totally cool with this. I'm just saying holistically. Next game I'm going to talk about, again, is League of Legends. And I think there's a lot of design patterns in MOBAs that are quite similar to roguelikes. I mean, just at the basic level, you have diverse tools and diverse challenges, and you're kind of figuring it out, right? So, game over game, players are often self-rotating their tools by trying different champions or builds. And additionally, your opponents are varying game to game. So sometimes you're going to have strengths, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're not really going to have the correct tool to deal with an opponent, at least the ideal tool. And when you're fighting against an opponent in League of Legends, you have to determine both your play style and how you build against them, like what skills you invest in, what items you buy, et cetera. So as an example, if you're playing Singed on top, Singed is this melee character who's very tanky and leaves trails of poison behind him. You can do pretty well against some of the melee characters, like Jax, for example, you do reasonably well against. You really don't do as well against, Teemo or Kayle or something like that. And additionally, so playing against those characters, you might shift your aggression level, you might shift your itemization. For example, against Jax, you generally go armor. Against Teemo and Kayle, you'd be looking at, I'm not actually sure the best way to be Kayle, but Teemo, you certainly would be looking into magic resistance. All of this so also on top of this, you're probably not going to encounter the same matchup game over game, right? You fight Teemo one game and you play Singed top again, which is not a given. You might encounter a totally different character next game. So what this means is there's a lot of random parallel learning opportunities where you might learn something important from your defeat to Teemo one game, and then 7 games later, try something you learned from that defeat and win and feel really good about it. Additionally, I think League of Legends sort of has elements of Hero or Zero. And obviously, League of Legends doesn't have permadeath, but it does have sharp consequentiality to actions. And it does have sharp progression. And getting a really ultra-high moment isn't super frequent. Moderately high moments are, but ultra-high moments aren't. So you're always going to remember that game where you did get a pentakill and just ace the entire enemy team. Or you're going to remember that game where you basically made a dramatic comeback from behind because of great play on your end. And that existence of the sharp progression, along with this other skill-based mastery elements, really allow these high moments to come out in League of Legends. One criticism I'd make, using these roguelike frameworks, is that, we discovered with ARAM, our community made ARAM, which was inspired by some earlier MOBA work, but our implementation of ARAM, gained a lot of appeal. And the reason I think it's appealing is we provide a way for players to be forced out of their comfort zone and leverage diverse tools and make do in a way that feels legitimate, and they would never opt into in an ordinary League of Legends game. And I think there's probably a lot of unexplored ground there, and we've tried to do some of this with our other game modes, and I really hope we can continue to find ways to get players a little bit outside their comfort zone, either in the primary game or in modes in the future, because I think that ultimately results in more mastery potential. I'd also love to find ways to have players, for example, play other roles than they're used to more often. The last game I want to talk about is Civ, and of course, Civ's one of the greatest games of all time. And certainly the basic game loop does have some similarity to roguelikes in terms of diverse tools, diverse challenges, sharp progression, so on and so forth. Zelda the Hero Zero thing going on. But although I think like some of the offshoots like Master of Magic probably embraced that a lot harder and got their appeal from that. But where I'd like to talk about on Civ the most is this idea of competing objectives and strategic commitment. And Sid Meier really pushed the whole interesting decisions framework, which has a lot of similarities in concept to this, and shares some commonality to the roguelikes. And an example of where, Civ, a lot of the gameplay is in the city building. And there's certainly a lot of interesting decisions here around like, build order and things like that. But a lot of them are masterful. And I find that as players get better and better at the game, most of the most interesting decisions at the city level start to be sort of beyond just the city placement, start to be like, wonder strategy or holistic military units versus not kind of decisions. And the problem is that a lot of the best decisions in Civ are decisions that are easily aligning short-term and long-term objectives where, look, you got a more populous city with more infrastructure, it's just kind of better. And it's kind of a no-brainer because you're relatively safe right now. And that lack of tension in the decisions available between the short and long-term decisions, I think is a little bit of a missed opportunity. And I think part of this is also that Civ by its nature just doesn't offer as many singular large decisions that could potentially nudge your strategy from economic strategy to like a war strategy or something. And there's a little bit of it there, but I think there's missed opportunity there. And I think like part of what was really great about Civ 5 is there are some things like that do that. Like for example, the natural wonders, if you encounter them early, can potentially cause you to change strategy and double down on faith or something. There's also there's a couple other things like that in general, but I think that's the alignment of incentives is kind of an issue. I also would say that Civ could probably do a better job of forcing players to make do with tools. I think Mu did this really well through a simple innovation, which was, and by the way, Mu 2 was a sort of space-themed version of Civ. It's kind of a simplification, but it's also a really great game. And one of their innovations was that when you're choosing technologies, you have to, unless you have a racial that allows you to get around this, you have to pick one technology. And some races don't even get to pick, they just get one of three. So if you're looking here, like, upper right there, you could get an ion drive, move ships faster, you could get ion pulse cannon, which is a pretty strong late early game kind of ship disabling weapon, be very efficient. And shield capacitors, which I believe increase your shield recharge rate. Nobody ever gets those. So there's two good options there. But that really forces players to make do, where they'll pick one and they're like, oh my god, I wasn't anticipating this problem. I don't have the right tech. How do I deal with it? Of course, modern Civ 5, I think, has developed into this a bit. Like the Venice city-state forces people outside their comfort zone a little bit, makes them make do in a different way. So Venice can't expand, so that's a different set of challenges, different set of strategies. Additionally, strategic resources can sometimes do this because you can't see strategic resources like iron and coal and so forth until you have the tech correlated to them. So you can definitely end up in situations where you don't have an important strategic resource, and that can be interesting as well. But in general, I don't think making players make do with things is something that Civ's fully explored or leveraged at this point. So that's all I have for non-roguelike game examples. And before I go into QA, I want to leave you guys with two suggestions. First, to the extent that your game is based on a mastery loop, I think you can just systematically go through things and just ask, like, hey, is there a way we can instill more opportunity for mastery in this mechanic in a way that's consistent with our other design values? And often the answer is yes. And then more generally, could you apply, some roguelike mastery approaches to it? Maybe that's a sticking point that might, maybe that's a mechanism to sort of unblock yourself there. And then as well, I would ask you guys again, to play broad games, play games very broadly. That's how we get better at our craft. That's how we spur innovation. That's how we make ever more engaging and fun games. So if there's a game that is popular and you don't really understand why it's popular, or you just aren't really interested, that might be a really great game for you to play and check out. So thanks again for coming. Please don't forget to fill out the speaker rating forms that will come to you over email. GDC needs the data to pick speakers, and if you learn something, I'd appreciate you taking the time to do that. So thanks again for attending my talk and spending the time. And I think the CAs will direct us for questions. Are we going right across? Or are we? Okay, so we'll do 10 minutes in here, and then we'll, afterwards, if there's still questions, we'll go after. So, questions? Hello.
Hi. Hi, Tom.
How you doing?
Good. I have a question about, I think back when the Hero and Zero section, you mentioned about being careful not to mix up different kinds of mastery.
You're talking about in-session and out-of-session progression?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, yes. Right.
Just to clarify my question, there are certain kinds of mastery that I would say are kind of independent of the game, say situational awareness or
sure.
The ability to process more information, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, should we be aiming to try to recognize those kinds of improvements within the game, or is it more of a responsibility of the individual or the community to sort of like recognize, hey, actually my discipline is, I deal with failure better as a person, that sort of thing?
I'm sorry, Philip. You're asking if there's, so you're asking about the Hero Zero pattern, or you're asking more generally? I'm not.
More generally, I guess. It was just a point you brought up on that one slide, but really more general.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's tons of different forms of mastery, and different games are going to offer different forms. I mean, if you have a turn-based strategy game, you're not really going to have executional, like, dexterity mastery. So, and I mean, you could even argue that there are some very, very different ones that would be foundational for other games. Do you have a specific one you wanted to ask about, or?
Well, let's say the ability to deal with failure as a person, right? It's like you lost, and then you could either be depressed, or you could say that's a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
That's something that could be mastered.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of PV games tap into that as well. We should talk more about it afterwards. Sure. Yes.
Yeah, so one game that often gets mentioned with roguelikes is like the Fortress mode from Dwarf Fortress. It has a lot of like commonalities with roguelikes because losing and all that. Yeah, and especially making do, like you said. One thing though that it's different, at least from what you were talking about with roguelikes, is that it's not so much that you remember the times when it went really well. You remember the times when it went really badly. But out of like a positive way, because it's fun to lose for some reason. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about like analysis of that, or if you played Dwarf Fortress.
I mean, I'm actually, unfortunately, so for my game that I need to go play that I know is popular, that's probably my game. I know a lot of designers at Riot are fans of it, so that is on my list for sure. I would, without playing the game, it's a little bit difficult for me to speculate, but I would speculate by saying that if something's really, really interesting, that can be memorable too. And that just distinctive, so the traditional roguelikes are geared for distinctive high points, but there's nothing to say that you couldn't gear a game for distinctive oddities or low points as well, and potentially. It sounds like they've accomplished that. I don't see a reason why it's not. It just seems easier maybe to go with the high points.
Right.
But I'm not saying anything's possible, and that seems logically consistent. Yes?
Hey, I'm wondering if you can speak any about finding a good balance between, I guess, implicit skills versus explicit skills. Like in Dark Souls, you get better just by fighting.
Yes.
Or you could go be explicit and add 100 to your strength and just start destroying everything.
Yeah, so you're talking about like if I upgrade your character and that mechanically, like if I give you 1 million souls and you go spend it, right. So I think actually a mixture can be really good, because certainly, I mean, World of Warcraft taps in this a lot, where it's like you're doing the boss and you're getting better. But you're not quite good enough, and then you do a bunch of farming, and then that pushed you over the edge, and that still feels like a victory. Like, I think a mixture can be good as a pressure valve for frustration, and actually, I'd argue that for any game where you're expecting a player to be confronting the same challenge repeatedly with a similar toolkit, you probably do want some progression as a pressure valve.
Thanks.
Yep. Yes.
Howdy. Thanks for the talk. I'm Jonathan Palmer. You talked about when players are given diverse tools, they have to look for creative solutions because they don't have the best tools. Yeah. And I think you sort of missed a good opportunity to tie in another element, which is a little bit reminiscent of the Stanley Parable talk earlier, where he mentioned when you don't explicitly point at things in your game and you have them hidden, players feel more inventive and they feel that greater degree of mastery or individuality when they stumble upon it. And by having those diverse tools, players learn your mechanics more deeply and they get that aha mastery moment. And I think that was something that fit very well in your talk. But
I agree with you. An earlier version actually did have that, and I had to trim it down. The example I had was, so I totally agree with you, was like Binding of Isaac has this thing called the blood donation machine, where you can bash your character in and take damage and get coins. And like, people who played for a while know that, like, oh, if I have an invulnerability item available, I could use that while doing that and take no damage and get coins. Like, that's those sorts of examples. I agree. I think that kind of deep understanding of the game world and the ways in which the mechanics and systems you leveraged are really rewarding when players can get to them. Absolutely. And I think, if we're making deep systems, we're gonna provide those opportunities for sure.
that said, and thank you for the cockatrice mention, it was my favorite weapon with gloves.
It is a good weapon. You can bash mobs and net hack and turn them into statues, but then you can't eat them unless you can eat rocks. So yes.
All right. Thank
Some
you.
characters can eat rocks.
So I was wondering about motivating a player to play a game with roguelike elements that it's very challenging. You may die a lot. You may run into the wrong decisions. You may face consequences, and at the same time making the player not feel overwhelmed, especially with entry-level players, because previously, if you felt overwhelmed by a game, you were like, well, I already bought it, so either I traded in or I beat it. So the motivation was there for trying to get around the game. But in this case, the game might be free to play, so there may be not much motivation to continue. So how would you deal with motivating entry-level players to overcome the challenges?
Yeah, okay, so the question is, given that roguelikes are really hardcore and are potentially really demotivating until people, quote, get it, unquote, what do you do? I would say there's two best practices that are leveraged. One is you make the early content just engaging and interesting, and that could be narrative, that could be humor, or it could just be that the game's really interesting and fun, the very basic levels. I think the alternative is you offer some very soft progression. Unlocks could be a really good way to do this that are potentially not power progression and thus don't run into some of this out-of-session, in-session dissonance. Like FTL does this with ship unlocks. I've been playing Dream Quest on my mobile phone. It's pretty fun, actually. They do a little bit more power progression, but it's still like, oh, you're playing and you're getting unlocks, and that feels good. So I think, just as long as the ceremony like that I mentioned would tie back in. If you're ceremonializing points or rewarding points, people will tend to, get through it better. How are we doing on time, CAs? 5 minutes? Okay, cool. Next.
Yeah, hi. Do you have any ideas or examples about how Roguelike framework would work with free-to-play business model?
I actually haven't, to be perfectly honest. I would say that, in general, a free-to-play model could be appropriate for any game that's long-term engaging, and roguelikes are. So I think that's plausible, but I honestly haven't thought about it deeply. Sorry. Next question.
Hi, I'm curious about your thoughts on horizontal versus vertical progression in the sort of out-of-game meta progression, like a game like FTL, where you get a new ship that lets you play differently, versus a game like Rogue Legacy or Dungeon Mans, where your character simply gets more powerful in a direct way. Yeah, so
going back to the principles I was talking about here, so the hero or zero pattern in particular is predicated on fairly precise control of the challenge difficulty and the player power. So you could combine it, but you get challenges there. The other piece is just, to the extent that those out-of-session progressions providing tools, you can also run into this undermining your virtue of making do. So what I would say is, I think Rogue Legacy is an awesome game. It's especially awesome considering the timeline it was made on and everything. I really like it. But I actually think that while it's an extremely fun game, it doesn't really encapsulate a lot of the core roguelike elements. It encapsulates some, but it doesn't really, the diverse tools, you're kind of incented to just reroll continuously until you get your clear kind of kit. And And then additionally, you can often end up in situations where you're basically farming reliably because your power level is so far ahead of the content. So I think it's a great game. I just think that you lose a lot of the values I've articulated here when you have too much out-of-session progression.
Thanks.
Next question.
Right, so I have a bit of a follow-up question to the previous one. So you mentioned that we need to be careful when mixing that in and out session progression for obviously that reason, undermining the make-do aspect of roguelikes. But I'd like to just know, for example, League of Legends does have a little bit of that parallel progression in and out of session. So do you feel that there is, well, and then again, long-term progression is a big driver for long-term engagement. So do you think they're completely incompatible?
Yeah, so they're not completely incompatible. Like all things in game design, out of session and session progression would just be a trade-off you're throwing against each other, and there's ways to reconcile that. So I think strong out of session progression is problematic, but in the case of League of Legends, there's a couple things going on. First, the power progression that players do undergo from 1 to 30 is primarily a midterm onboarding solution. It's not a long-term thing. The customization that emerges from that is a long-term strategy formation thing. But there's almost like background radiation, right? Like when you're level 30, you're playing level 30s who have the same amount of unlocks as you. So it's not, we're sort of balancing the game to that, just in the same way that like, hey, like if we increased the health of everything in the game by 20%, we wouldn't be changing things that much. Or if we increase DPS and health across the board by 20%, we'd have exactly the same game. So I think you get a lot of a pass there. The other thing is, like I said, it's really about the amount, right? Like, and if there's a lot of out-of-session progression, you start to risk the ability to do really good, sharp in-session progression. But if you do moderate or small amounts of it, I think it has been shown that you can be effective with that. So that would be my response to that.
All right, thanks.
Okay, sure. Next question.
I guess my question is actually slightly related to that. A lot of the examples you have, like Binding of Isaac or FTL, tend to be, it's kind of okay to write off the times that you fail and to focus on the times you have the epic success. But I'm wondering if you could talk about some of, I guess I'll go with difficulties in games that have much higher level play, such as League of Legends, and how those kind of snap decisions and the elements of fun in deciding that aren't really an option. You're expected to know the correct result for any situation, and how you sort of could still apply some of those design areas, but not have running those sticking points. That makes sense.
Right. Trying to think how to rephrase your question. I think if you go back to the principles I'm outlining, like diverse tools in making do, right? Like you could apply that by looking at a character and just sort of asking like, are any of these actually a Swiss Army knife? Because we know that's generally going to be bad design. Or, do I actually have B and C level plays in this frustrating situation? Because if I don't, that's also not very interesting. So a lot of that, I think you'd normally frame that as just sort of conventional play balance. On Hero or Zero, you could also say, like, is it, if we think it's desirable to have the ultra high moments, are we adequately supporting extreme character progression? We actually had a point in League of Legends where we tapered off hyper progression too much in the beta, and the game suddenly wasn't very fun. So we re-added a lot of snowballing to the game because that was a necessary element for it to be a really compelling game, as an example. So I think, like I said, I don't think you can literally interpret this stuff one-to-one, but if you understand why it's motivating to players in the context of roguelike, I think that you can then map it into the destination genre and think about, like, okay, well, it's a mastery-driven game, and you're kind of having this experience here, and what might be the similarity. So, yes.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on balancing social pressure versus kind of rewarding trade-off decisions. So part of what makes roguelike so fun is you take the situation where I'm going to do something really risky, and maybe on the outside might look a little crazy, but it's all going to play out in the end because I'm building towards something really niche, perhaps.
Right.
But in multiplayer settings, a lot of times there's pressure to play more conservatively. Like there's a known good or there's a known safe, and your risks are, your failures are kind of much more penalized. So how can you seize on that?
Right. So you're saying that there's a lot of social pressure in games, and that taking a ballsy decision wouldn't be accepted. That's specifically. Sorry about that. That specifically is why just a straight co-op multiplayer port of roguelikes really hasn't been done super successfully yet, because you're trying to make these nuanced strategic decisions and hard commit based partially on your intuition. Yeah, it's hard to get a team gelled around that. I mean, you probably could, but it's pretty tough. And so I think the analogy to that, like in League of Legends, would be like, I don't know, like I'm playing Jungle Udyr and I'm supposed to play tanky, kind of, but because I'm going Phoenix farm and kind of being tanky, and and I just happen to get a couple early kills, and I'm kind of looking at my gold total, and the bot lane just got a tower, and I'm like, maybe I should get Trinity Force, and maybe that would be okay to go a damage build. So I still think there's some of those opportunities, but like I said, you can't apply all these principles to every game. I think the right approach to do it is you take things that have mastery and you look for the analogy and you ask if it does make sense, and sometimes it's going to make sense, and sometimes it's not, because the roguelikes, and I alluded to this, and have a bunch of interlocking methods that make all of these work together consistently. And when they show up in other games, you get partial combinations that are self-reinforcing and other substitutes to bridge some of the deficiencies that are generated by having a different game context. So, we're out of time. Okay, so we're going to call this. We're going to go. What room is it, CA team? 2002. We're going to do 2002. I will be walking over there momentarily.